This is Norway, the fifth richest country in the world, sharing borders with Sweden, Finland, and Russia, just above the North Sea. So rich that 25% of its population are millionaires. The world's seventh healthiest country and the world's most democratic country, Norway tops all the indicators used to measure the prosperity of any country. But Norway was not always like this. At the end of the 18th century, the famous economist Thomas Malthus visited snow-weary Norway and saw a country whose people subsisted on a little farming, a mountainous country in which travel was almost impossible. The towns were remote and isolated, and their citizens were poorly educated. In this country, there were 6 months of winter, due to which agriculture was very difficult, and people could barely brown bread for 2 meals a day. A few years after Thomas left Norway, the situation in Norway worsened. The economy of Norway was completely destroyed. The poverty spread throughout the country, and it seemed that this poverty was the destiny of Norway. Then how come such a big change? How did Norway become such a developed and rich country? These are all the countries that have 85% of the world's oil reserves: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, Libya, Russia, and Venezuela. But their combined GDP is only 8% of the world's GDP. And none of these countries appear in the list of the top 10 richest countries in the world. On the other hand, Norway is the 13th largest oil-producing country in the world, but it is the 4th best country in the world in terms of quality of life. So what is the reason why these countries are not even close to Norway in living standard despite producing so much oil? The reason for this is the phenomenon that economists call the oil curse. The problem with oil is that it is just like winning the lottery. After the oil is extracted, money starts pouring into the nations overnight. But the rulers of the country use this money to reduce taxes and increase spending. The oil industry overshadows the rest of the country's industries. As these countries export oil, the demand for their local currency increases, making it easier for citizens of that country to buy imported goods. And as a result, the local industries of the country begin to suffer. As the local companies start to close down, the unemployment in the country starts to increase, and money gets into the hands of only a few people. And the common man gets angry, and this anger leads to protests and eventually revolt. This is what happened to Libya and Venezuela, but why this oil curse did not affect Norway. Actually, in the 19th century, the entire economy of Norway was driven by sea trade. Due to its great port location, timber fish and various minerals from Norway were transported to Europe and the Asian countries by sea. By the early 1900s, Norway had built the largest merchant fleet in the world, controlling about 30% of the North Sea's trade, and one of the biggest things Norway did was to create a parliamentary system, the main purpose of which was that political power and money should not go into the hands of a single person or party. Norway also received another favor from nature, and that was the potential of cheap hydroelectricity generation, but at that time, 75% of Norway's hydropower generation companies were foreign, and this thing was quite a shock to the Norwegian government. They finally decided that only Norwegians would exploit Norway's natural resources. In 1940, the Norwegian government passed a bill barring foreign companies from ownership of hydropower projects. At the same time, the introduction of railways and a modern transport system gave Norway's local industry a much-needed boost. Between 1945 and 1970, Norway's GDP growth was 3.3%. Norway had the highest taxes in the world, but most of the taxes the government was spending on education, people's welfare, and supporting local industry. By 1965, unemployment in Norway was almost non-existent. Norway had now caught up with the rest of Europe, but was still not at the level as it is today. But this was all about to finally change. In 1969, with the discovery of natural gas deposits in the Netherlands, meanwhile, speculation began among experts that there would be oil reserves under the Northern Sea. In 1966, a company called Philip Petroleum began drilling for oil in the North Sea. After nearly 2 years of drilling, no oil reserves were discovered. Everyone was disappointed. Philip Petroleum made one last try, this time full deep drilling, and finally, in 1969, huge oil reserves were discovered under the North Sea. After which, in less than 10 years, Norwegian oil production became more than any other country in the world. The oil sector began to create thousands of jobs. Fishing towns were now petroleum powerhouses. Billions of dollars began to flow in, and Norway's destiny changed. But this happened to Middle Eastern countries too. So what different Norway did? The government of Norway had already passed this bill that no single party or person would control natural resources, and all the income from it would be spent only on the welfare of the people. All the profits coming from oil started to be spent on infrastructure and education. Norway could have reduced taxes like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but it did not do so. Instead, it collected taxes and kept paying them back to the people. Secondly, the Norwegian government created a pension fund in 1990 to promote the rest of the country's sectors, the purpose of which was only to invest in the companies of other sector than that of oil sector. The biggest benefit of this was that the rest of Norway's local industries also began to flourish. As a result, their unemployment began to decrease further, and Norway's dependence on the oil sector ended. Norway also became a world leader in exports of timber, paper, metals, and other minerals. And then it came to the top in the list of the most developed countries in the world. Many other countries still have the natural resources that Norway had, but they could not replicate Norway's success. The main distinction is that true democracy involves long-term planning and being truthful with its citizens.